Once more, welcome to this launch of the e-mobility country profiles. We have a total of 7 countries to be sharing with you and discussing over these next couple of days. We'll start off with the East Africa country profiles, and the 3 main countries are Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Now, this presentation is just a brief of whatever has been put in the detailed sort of one-page reports, and we have a few moderators with us to help me discuss these profiles, dig into them further. I'll introduce them, at least after going through just a couple of slides with some of the high-level pointers as to what we observed when we are collecting data and putting together the profiles. So to start off, one of the first countries is Kenya. And from our reports and from our analysis, we were ranking across 4 major areas: policy, obviously looking at some of the fiscal incentives that have been put in place, the level of government engagement in providing for incentives and regulations, as well as acts of government that can help in incentivizing the importation, distribution, and even rollout of general charging infrastructure and electric vehicle products. The second category was energy costs. And for this, we are comparing the relative cost of fuel with regards to the relative cost of electricity. And we would assess, based on the difference between the two, on how favorable it is for facilitating a transition, moving from fossil fuel dependency to electricity. On the private sector criteria, we were checking at how many companies are active in the particular country, as well as the sort of diversity across the different segments. So 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, and 4-wheelers, and commercial or public transport vehicles. And finally, our last ranking was around environment. And this was primarily driven by the level of cleanliness of the grid, so the amount of renewable energy generation sources that were being pumped into the grid, and eventually that will be used to charge these electric vehicles. Kenya showed some interesting dynamics. Even though it's had the highest private sector activity, the adoption of standards is also another commendable act, given the 21 standards that have been adopted and even more that are in the pipeline. It was one of the countries to adopt standards for electric vehicles in Africa, as well as working on an e-mobility policy for supporting players that are already in the market and the rollout of these electric vehicle products and charging infrastructure. On the fuel side, it's moderately subsidized. It's not, in comparison to other countries where the fuel price has not really been subsidized, the cost is a lot higher. But in Kenya, even though the subsidies are slowly coming off, it's still relatively low. The private sector, again, I've spoken about this, and obviously the grid is very clean. It's only second to Uganda, and I'll show in the next slide. But the main sort of renewable energy contributor in Kenya has been geothermal power. In comparison to Uganda, for instance, the main contribution has been coming from hydroelectricity. In Uganda, the policy environment is a little bit different. It's not as advanced as probably other African countries. So far, Ministry of ICT has been the one leading the charge on adoption of or pushing for policies, even though there hasn't been any policies that have been implemented to our knowledge as of yet. The cost of fuel, because of little to no subsidies, is actually very high. And that has triggered or makes a much easier transition from comparing the cost of fuel per kilometer vis-a-vis the cost of electricity for powering an EV by the same kilometer. The market dynamics are also biased mainly towards the 2-wheeler segment, with majority of the companies being electric motorcycle companies, except for one bus company that's there. We'll get to discuss a bit more about what are some of the reasons for this bias and how else or what priorities need to be set in place to bring in more investments across the 4-wheeler segment, across smaller commercial vehicles, as well as charging infrastructure. But Uganda has the cleanest grid with over 90% generation coming from hydroelectricity. Finally, on the comparison is Tanzania. So the policy environment is also a little bit different, where from our assessment when we were there early in September, the policy environment is clearly underdeveloped, but right now efforts have started, especially from the Tanzania Bureau of Standards, on understanding more about the needs of the electric vehicle companies that are operating there. The diversity is still very low. We surveyed only a handful of companies, and even the size of their fleets that they were piloting was not substantive enough. There aren't any, subsidies. They're still quite small on the fuel side. So it makes for the transition also a lot more lucrative in Tanzania compared to a country like Kenya. And finally, because of the addition of natural gas into their grid, the grid or the environment component is not as highly ranked just because of the resources that are being used to generate power in that country. So that's a high-level summary. I'm sure the detailed report has been already sent to your emails. You might have that open. This is a brief comparison of the 3 countries. I'll now invite the panelists. Let me quickly stop sharing my screen so that we can recognize the panelists in the room as they introduce themselves and briefly offer their comments on the profiles that we had shared out. So firstly, we have Robert Njoroge from the Kenya Bureau of Standards. We also have Daniel Dreher from Uganda, that's Zembo. We have Jacqueline Senyego from UMI, operating in Tanzania. And then we have Jerry Ndayishimiye from Rwanda. Robert, if you're in the room, please introduce yourself and give us a few comments. Let me know in case you want me to display the presentation.
Yeah, please do. Okay. Thank you, Warren. My name is Robert Njoroge. I work for the Kenya Bureau of Standards. In e-mobility, I'm the technical committee manager of the e-mobility technical committee. So thank you, Warren. That was a very nice brief presentation. And actually, I commend you for the great work that EMDA is doing in regards to creating these country profiles. I believe we didn't have like a resource area where we could understand, or even maybe investors could understand what is happening in Africa, because there's been a lot of interesting investment. So yeah, okay, now going to the country profile, actually it's good for Kenya, actually for all countries. It's great work, great analysis. It highlights most of the key interesting parts. My additional comment to it would be for the renewable, sorry, I'm actually looking at the country profile that it sent. So for the renewable energy or generation by source, I think it would be good to actually include the specific percentage of the generation by source, so that we can actually get the actual figure. If it's geothermal, whether it's 47% or 45%. I think that is that's what I saw from the country profile, and just hopefully, I hope we can eventually get data from NTSA for Kenya in terms of what the number of electric vehicle fleet that is for the two-wheelers, four-wheelers, and the buses. So I think that data would be very important for us. But I know the challenge that we have in terms of getting data from NTSA that they've not actually sent.
Just repeat.
Sorry, where did I break the call?
Okay, it was just a last comment after you had mentioned around getting data from NTSA.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I said I believe the same comments apply for the other 3 countries. That is Uganda as well as Tanzania.
Okay. Yeah, that's noted. From the country profiles, we'd indicated approximate numbers of fleets across each of the segments. Maybe that's something else that if we have time in the end, I'll just display the profiles as we had sent them. And also I see comments in the chat of people who hadn't really seen the report, so I'll be happy to display that. Daniel, welcome. Over to you to also offer some brief remarks.
Thanks, Warren, and the whole team for the invite to speak today. Quickly, for the ones who do not know me, I'm Daniel Dreher, one of the co-founders of Sembo Motorcycles. We are the first company who built battery swapping stations in East Africa, notably in Uganda, and are currently operating a fleet of 220 motorcycles and 27 stations across Greater Kampala and a corridor along Masaka Road, which is some 250 kilometers away from Kampala. I'm sure Tom knows the mileage a little bit better than I do. But yeah, and therefore I'm very, very happy that we finally have somebody picking up this important task here of lobbying and giving also our policymakers some background information. Because right now I see for my country, Uganda, the policy just with one star, and I know that there are very many talks how to improve the situation for the e-mobility companies. Not just on the bus side, where we have the flagship with Jira Motors, but also on the motorcycle side with us and Bodawerk and other players like Mojo. So I'm very happy that we have those country profiles now, and we can present something which is very independent or kind of independent towards the government and show, hey, look, this is the way forward. That's how your work in terms of policy stands against the neighboring partner countries in the East African community. So I'm very happy to share this further also here in Uganda locally with the policy and decision makers.
Great. Maybe just a follow-up question or request is, can you at high level just indicate maybe any justifications for why the policy situation is not progressed as much, and what would be the sort of policy priorities, let's say, for Uganda, now that you've operated all these mini charging stations and have rolled out quite a significant number of bikes? What have been the sort of priorities that you've been trying to push the government for?
So on our side, from just speaking about the motorcycle side, it's definitely an e-mobility electricity tariff. I mean, we do have this abundance of electricity in the country. I actually looked at the data for the Q1 in this year, and we exported enough electricity, just exported to run 600,000 bodas. So here we have a surplus of electricity and we want to use it. But we have the chicken and egg problem. Of course, the electricity tariff gets bigger, smaller and smaller, the bigger your stations get. But right now we were still focused on the area coverage. So we have a lot of stations and not all of them are busy to get a commercial or industrial connection. So this is one important point for us. Then the other one is around skilling programs, as we will have a huge number of motorcycles and also a good number of electric buses now on the road here. We need the labor force which is skilled to maintain, to repair, but also to assemble and manufacture those parts here. And the other one is around the typical customs and tax initiatives. But the government also wants to look into off-buy agreements so that the government agencies go electric first, notably with cars, buses, and motorcycles. So those are the key points which we are discussing with the government at the moment.
Okay, thank you. It sounds like a mix of both the fiscal and non-fiscal measures, where the fiscal ones could touch on the electricity tariff, the different rates of tax incentives, as well as now on the non-fiscal, we probably need a lot more investment in the technical expertise to encourage, uptake of these vehicles as well as keeping them on the road.
Yeah.
I'll then invite Jacqueline Senyego from UMI. Jacqueline, if you're in the room, please feel free to introduce yourselves and also give us your comments and your views, especially on the market that you're operating in, your activities in Tanzania.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you so much for your informative presentation. As I think the profile that you're displaying right now is exactly the situation on the ground. There's not so much happening in terms of policy for renewable energy, or rather for electric. It's safer to say for electric mobility. The only commitment, or rather some mention of intentions at national level, goes through the nationally determined contributions, where the country commits into moving to cleaner energies in the transport sector. So the acknowledgement first that one of the main contributors to environmental pollution is the transport sector, and so some very general mention, or rather commitments, of saying that the country is planning to move towards cleaner energies, especially in the transport sector. And then you have now renewable energy commitments generally through the energy policy committing to support the renewable energy sector. So at policy level, really, you find most of the operators currently in Tanzania are operating in I would say in a more, they get support from the institutions, government institutions, in more of an ad hoc manner. So I've spoken to two operators already, one in Moshi and one in Dar es Salaam, and it's totally different the way they do things. So the registration, for instance, for Bigfoot in Moshi involves getting a registration certificate offered by the police officers, and so they move around using that, and if they're stopped anywhere, they would show that certificate. Whereas for Tree, I think it's a different kind of arrangement. So it's more of a reactive way of accommodating the electric mobility sector at the moment. And even when you deal with Tanzania Bureau of Standards, also is they use very generous standard, for instance, for, let's say, for electric vehicles, or for batteries, for instance, or for, there's nothing very specific for electric mobility in the standards as well. So you'd find components here and here on the batteries, let's say, or electric parts and stuff like that. And of course, on batteries, it's more on the it falls under the electronic waste, because of course it's important to deal with the waste produced from batteries. So it depends. I mean, with different institutions, it depends on which angle you're looking at, because of course electric mobility is quite big in itself. I mean, there are several things you have to deal with. And again, you come to TANESCO, there is not much done about electric mobility, and I can assure you, even in the forecast and projections, it is not taken into consideration. So it's good to bring these issues up, to start the discussions, to get the officers aware and stuff like that. Because for TANESCO, it's more interesting to get customers coming to you saying they want connection. It means more revenue, it means more money for them. But it's good to also reflect how this the whole thing is happening and unfolding in the Tanzanian context, to be able to accommodate the demands that comes from the electric mobility side of things. Yes, so private sector is also quite small, but things are happening quite fast, I must say. And in the last 2 months, I've not been able to catch up with some private sector companies that I've heard of in the country that are getting into electric mobility. But I think the marketing is opening up and people are really picking up the technology and generating business. So at least from solution side, we are testing the solution with two startups, Autotrack from Kenya, who are doing retrofitting, and they're also assembling electric bajajes, working with the Dar es Salaam Institute of Technology. And then we also have the SESCOM. They're doing retrofitting. So we hope these kinds of demonstrations will also kind of stimulate that kind of market. But of course, we have a number of motorcycles, electric motorcycles, and it's very interesting to see individuals in the middle of town trying to establish a charging station, and they're earning something small from it. But we're also hoping to have more of the charging stations through the BRT, because part of our solutions in this project in Tanzania is to have electric three-wheelers doing the last and first mile connectivity. So at least charging stations, we expect the BRT system to have these charging stations at some point to be able to connect to charge the bajajes, the three-wheelers, as they wait for passengers. Yeah, but I'm sure there's also I know about a company. I'm sorry, it's not on top of my mind, but in Kariakoo, it's a Chinese company that are also doing electric three-wheelers, but very smaller in number, and they don't carry people. They carry luggages across Kariakoo, goods, and they carry goods across Kariakoo, and they charge where they wait for the goods. But the main business, as they told me, is carrying goods either within the city center or just in the vicinity of the center. They don't travel very far. And of course, it's because of the availability of a charging place, though this is a charge and go kind of design. But you want to be sure you'll be able to charge it. You want to be sure it will travel in for the kilometers before you're able to charge again. Such things are the things that have been limiting these smaller kind of three-wheelers within the city center. So in terms of business, that is where we are. But of course, there's so much to be done. But I find institutions, I see the government very open and welcoming to the electric mobility idea, and I'm sure different actors are working at different levels to set the environment right and roll out the electric mobility sector. Yeah, thank you. I think I've said enough, or maybe too much already.
No, but you've raised some really interesting points around how different the market is, and even how government is perceiving these electric vehicles depending on the sort of region within the country. So I'm still just wondering, and maybe we'll come to this in the Q&A session, but how is that difference in probably registration between the two cities going to be implemented, maybe at national level? How is registration, mandated to only the city level, or how are those documents or permits seen at the national level? And what do you think needs to be done, maybe to start harmonizing some of these government processes so that there's efficiency in registration of this vehicle? There's a single database. There's even one category for electric motorcycles, and not, depending on the city that's registering the vehicles, they might register them a bit differently. So I don't know if you see those as challenges, and whether there are concrete steps that maybe you can even indicate what needs to be done to start harmonizing these sort of high-level government processes.
Thank you for your question, or rather observation. So if I look at the two regions, in Moshi, the registration was rather offered by a police officer or a police station, or the police authority, I would say. Whereas the tree situation in Dar es Salaam is more from the Tanzania Revenue Authority guys. So, I mean, if I look at things, it should actually happen from the Tanzania Revenue Authority. These are the people who are registering every vehicle that comes into the country. So for me, it's very important for the Tanzania Revenue Authority and the police, for instance, to sit together and discuss the issues that needs to, to be harmonized, so that it happens in a centralized place. And if I must, I mean, if I'm to say who has to take the lead, who is supposed to be doing the things, it will be Tanzania Revenue Authority, because they're the ones who are registering every vehicle that comes into the country. With regard to TBS, it's also important. I mean, TBS is the standard guys. They're the ones who are saying, okay, we can accept vehicles of these standards. We can accept vehicles if they come in this form of shape and stuff like that. So for the start to start and get things going, at least four people should be sitting together and talking about these things. And this will be the LATRA, the Land Transport Authority of Tanzania, the TBS, Tanzania Bureau of Standards, the TRA. So at least there's a communication between these three, and each one is clear with how they should make things happen in this sector. And then after at least some of the issues have been concretized in from these three organizations, then the policy discussions and policy issues can be steered and set clearly. But of course, for me, when it comes to initiating policy talks, initiating, the laws and regulations, as much as it is a government process, the private sector has such a big role to play, and sometimes they kind of set the environment for it. So the push needs to come from the private sector, from the non-government organizations who are actually in practice and initiate those discussions, bringing actors together, private sector. I mean, all actors now in the e-mobility landscape, and then discuss issues, the challenges, and the things that will actually propel the e-mobility sector in Tanzania. So the issue of initiation, of course, has to come from, I mean, according to how I see it, it should be coming from the private sector, but of course involving all these other stakeholders to make things happen. But I mean, if it's not also private sector, it could be the non-governmental organizations, it could be the bilateral, multilateral donors, it could be any other actor that is interested in electric mobility to start such initiatives and pushing further to make things happen.
Yeah, I think from a registration point, and it's really that conversation has to start from the national government. And obviously, private sector normally leads some of the policy guidance and regulation. Regulations will always follow private sector activity. And clearly, that's what is happening in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, as companies are still rolling out. I'll just quickly, for the sake of time, go on to the last moderator, but of course not the least. And this is an interesting panelist from Rwanda, Mr. Jerry Ndayishimiye from Sul Mobility in Rwanda. If you're in the room, it would also be great to get your input, and especially your perspective based on what sort of implementations have happened in Rwanda as far as policy, as even market activity. Rwanda is quite ahead, and we've seen a lot of the activities coming from there, from the government and private sector. So Jerry, over to you for just brief comments before we open it up to the audience. Feel free to put in your questions to the panelists that we have today. Feel free to ask questions around some of these ratings that you see. We have the moderators here, the panelists, to respond to some of the questions. And anything else, we can always note it down, and any improvements on these metrics or any insights, that would also be quite interesting. So Jerry, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much. Just to check if everyone is hearing me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
Yes.
so my name is Jerry Ndaishimie, and I'm the Business Development and Marketing Manager at SUL e-Mobility, which stands for Safi Universal Link. And it's SUL in e-Mobility is generally an e-mobility solutions provider offering EV cells, capacity building, assembling, maintenance and repairs, as well as leasing programs and leasing softwares to the general public, with an emphasis on the electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers in Africa. But we started with Rwanda first, and quickly, scaled into other countries, mainly Ethiopia, Senegal. We have presence in Senegal. We have presence in DRC, and currently establishing ourselves in Uganda as well. And we're also looking to explore Kenya as well. So what I can see here, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, definitely the comparison is quite educative and informative. What maybe I can share, because I'm more knowledgeable in the Rwandan business scene, especially in the e-mobility part, where what we have seen is that there's need to also include the beneficiaries of this shift. By the shift, I'm talking about mentioning the electric mobility transition, from fossil fuel to e-mobility solutions. So the way we have shaped it, coming into a market where e-mobility was pretty much inexistent, we looked at the business scene and we realized that it's not just the government pushing for policies, and it's not just the innovators and founders bringing the solutions, but it involves, a broader approach where you have to involve the innovators themselves, who are the ones bringing the solutions. But the government has to come in and chip in, because they have to create a structure with their policies and lawmaking that will make the environment friendly for these solutions to thrive. But then on the other hand, if you don't have, if the market is somehow inexistent, if the industry itself is somehow inexistent, you lack the skill set, you lack the expertise, you lack a lot of things. So if you're bringing the solutions and there's no one to actually implement it and see through that the solutions, gradually scale or grow within the market, then you're just holding your horses and not really progressing. So that's where we thought of involving international donors, international organizations, DFIs, so that we can create a capacity building program that will make sure that in the next 3 to 5 years we'll have e-mobility enthusiasts, e-mobility experts, especially considering the youth who don't necessarily consider electric mobility as a career, because that market was no longer there. Was never there. So we are working with universities, the education sector, along with these partners, international partners, to now create this future generation for e-mobility. So if you bring this together, you have the solution brought by the innovators, you have the policies that will help the solutions thrive, and you have the manpower and labor force that will make sure that these solutions are gradually scaling over time. But then you can't really talk about the progress or the scaling or the full transition if you don't consider the actual beneficiaries or the operators or the people, the target people who are going to adopt these solutions. So are they really, what's their drive? Are they really that eco-conscious, so that you can maybe sell the idea that they're not polluting the environment? Or are they really more on the side of how they can save the last, coin, or the, the last bill that they have to pay over time. So you have to analyze this, and you have to craft your message along with all stakeholders involved, especially the government, as well as the international partners and the solution providers themselves, so that this message is actually touching the pain points of the beneficiaries and ensuring they're, considering the migration to from their comfort zone, current, systems or modes of transport to where you want them to be. And this ultimately gives you this the approach where, the e-mobility now is considered at the household level, which ultimately is the way forward to ensure mass adoption of electric mobility. So Rwanda has been quite elaborate in terms of political will and driving this forward, where, for example, we have a full import duty waiver on all electric vehicles, spare parts and accessories. You have zero VAT on all electric vehicle related purchases and transactions. You have discounted tariffs on costs of electricity to reduce EV charging costs with the aim of encouraging the adoption of electric vehicles. But at the same time, there was an e-mobility policy development and committee created, and involves all parts of the markets or the industry that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, so that they can help drive this forward and make sure that transport in Rwanda is, sustainable and green in the next 5 to 10 years. And currently, the Rwanda is rushing with a very, very huge and quite ambitious goal of turning 33% of all the two-wheelers in the country into electric in the next 2 years, 28% of buses in the next 2 years, the same period, as well as 8% of private vehicles into electric as well, and also looking at how they can attach a cost or a fine or some type of fee that it will any private vehicle owner will have to pay to sustain their license of owning that vehicle. So this e-mobility committee is helping to craft new policies to drive the market forward. So that's what I can say in general. And I'm hoping to learn more about the Kenya market and Uganda as well as Tanzania, like my colleagues mentioned.
Yeah, some really interesting points, especially around how Rwanda has sort of taken the path towards supporting mobility with this big push, especially from the government, and which has been backed by a lot of the private sector activities. There was a question in the chat section around what sort of policy would be ideal for pushing for e-mobility. And in this case, even just from your experience and seeing some of the market activities, what sort of policies have made the biggest impact? I know definitely implementation of any policies on incentivizing EVs would be much needed today for any African country. But what sort of priority, in your priority list, what sort of 1 or 2 policies have really made an impact in triggering some of the market activities?
Yes, that's an interesting question. There's a lot of, parameters that you can consider, but one that I can mention that has really played effective here on the market in Rwanda is putting the beneficiaries first, putting the beneficiaries at the core, at the center of everything. And by this is considering their pain points mainly, which is how much they're spending. And today, given the volatility of prices of fuel, it's always, it's now skyrocketing. Everyone is looking to save their last dime. So this is where now e-mobility is coming in handy, and government, painting a picture that e-mobility is the ultimate way of, escaping the huge costs attached to, transportation. So we're also looking at, because e-mobility is also somehow related to non-motorized transport and independent from fuel, it helps people to save. So people are really adopting it in this regard. And now the challenge that has been there is mainly the range anxiety issue, because e-mobility tends to be secluded in an area. For example, if you don't have charging station or swapping station up country, someone who has an EV will not consider a long trip there, which is a very big challenge. Now, the government of Rwanda has already launched different approaches to mitigate this in terms of availing public land to e-mobility players to install these charging stations and swapping stations. In this way, to completely waive the cost either of acquiring the land or leasing the land, and then help the cost of charging to the public, electric vehicle charging to the general consumer, become very minimal. So right now, when we started 5 years ago, for example, the two-wheelers, the prices was actually above $2,000 to acquire. And the other two-wheelers, ICE vehicles right now were very, very significantly below that. And it includes licenses and everything. So the government, when it chipped in with these incentives, what ultimately happened is that the price of acquiring the EV narrowed down very quickly. And then they also thought about incentives that would help the consumers save money in maintaining these vehicles. For example, like I mentioned, the charging cost, which right now is offered at the industry-rated tariffs. So it's quite very minimal. And if you're offering public land without, rent, which is rent-free and everything, the investors or the solutions providers are able to bring down the consumer price in terms of energy cost for charging as well. So this has played key. I would say everything is revolving around the beneficiary and their pain points, and this is what is driving the market forward and very quickly. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, Jerry. Pretty insightful around the implementations in Tanzania. I'll just also pull in Robert from Kenya. I know, Robert, you've been leading a lot of the standards discussions. Even as IAMDA, we're involved in part of the technical committees around standards. And part of the reason Kenya has received a higher rating on the policy side is also because of the push on standards. So briefly, can you just also talk to us about what that standards experience is like, why it's important, and how that ties into some of the private sector activities in terms of enabling, scalability, maybe even a conversation around interoperability, and ensuring that there are products that are safe and of high quality that can be used by the end consumers.
Okay, thank you, Warren.
Yeah.
Warren.
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I can see Kenya actually, it seems we're doing well on the policy area, and I also suspected it's because of standards. So yes, we do have standards for e-mobility, and on that front, we're actually doing quite well. And I can actually foresee us actually taking more stars if it was just standards. But I'll just put a disclaimer on policy that we need more supportive policies as a country. We need to actually look up to Rwanda in terms of having supportive policies on charging infrastructure and fiscal incentives that I'll speak about later. So for standards, we did standards back in 2018, and that was just to support the safety specifications for now the battery electric vehicles. We also did standards on testing, as well as for hybrid vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, as well as electric motorcycles and mopeds. So those standards basically were just to give a baseline for testing, inspection. That is not the specifications. We use them for inspection. And now, at that time, we did a series of 24 standards, which were all ISO adoptions. But after that, what we ended up doing, I can report before the end of the year, we'll have at least 14 more standards on testing. So that is quite an interesting set of standards that we intend to adopt that will just cover more test specifications for electric vehicles. Now it will just cover the motors, the inverters, the DC to DC converters, the motor systems. Basically, what we are doing is confirming that all the EVs that we have in the country meet international standards. So there's a disclaimer there that we don't have we still have gaps in terms of testing facilities for all these standards that we are developing. But now to address the chicken and egg situation, because we can't wait till we set up test facilities, we decided let's have the standards first, and also it can inform us as the Bureau of Standards to actually invest in testing facilities. Then also we develop standards for mopeds and the connection of mopeds and motorcycles to external power supplies. So that is, I think it's the first standard on charging infrastructure for electric motorcycles. I believe next year we'll move on to more standards on electric vehicle charging infrastructure standards. But with all that good news, I believe I have to also shed light into the areas where we are yet, or rather we are lagging behind, and that is basically on inspection of used electric vehicles. This has been a thorny issue for us, and I believe it will similarly be an issue to other African countries, because we consume a lot of used vehicles. So it goes without saying that will slowly start consuming used electric vehicles. So we don't have any standard that can be used to inspect used vehicles. And so issues such as monitoring the battery health or the state of battery during import, and whether an EV has enough life to last to be used, or rather it will come to the country of importation and just die. So that is a thorny issue that we are looking into. However, since at the end of the day, we've really not reached critical mass in terms of the vehicles that we have here, it has not yet cropped up as a substantive issue. But for me, I feel that is an issue which we need to move fast and address. And I hope we can be able to partner up with other players in the market and other NGOs, actually even in the East African region, we can decide to partner up with Tanzania and Uganda at the EAC level and come up with a standard for inspection of used EVs. So that is the biggest challenge that we've come across so far. However, also we've not yet done standards for general charging infrastructure for four-wheelers. But that, as of now, we are seeing some light at the end of the tunnel that we'll be able to do by next year. So, and in terms of interoperability, given that in the four-wheeler space, we've seen that there's some sort of agreement in the types of chargers which are being used internationally. We can comfortably try and zero in on what chargers we foresee to be used in the coming years. But that does not mean that we are going to do standards to restrict. At the end of the day, standards are used to enhance trade. So what those standards on charging infrastructure will cover, it's just the safety requirements. But we'll also advise now the policy makers or implementers to actually zero in on a specific type of charger and actually recommend connectors where there is need. So that has not been so much of a challenge. but the issue on interoperability mostly will be in the electric 2 and 3-wheeler space. There, I think even URN and other players, you know, there's the issue on the battery swap stations, the size of batteries, the connectors. That is the area where there's a huge challenge, but we are up for the task and hopefully we'll come into agreement. And also we are looking at the international space. We are seeing Taiwan, they are about to develop a standard on battery swapping stations. So we'll try and adapt that standard together with other players in the market in Kenya. That is if there will be an agreement, or rather there'll be agreement on the specifications. So that is where we are at. Those are the challenges that we faced. And a brief on policy. I hope that for us as Kenya, we'll be able to have more supportive policies on charging infrastructure. That is policies where I believe the previous speakers spoke about Rwanda's commitment to giving free land. And for us, I believe with the support of, I've seen KenGen and Kenya Power, they are intending to roll out public charging stations. That would be really good. And it would be nice if that can be anchored in some sort of policy. I believe Ministry of Transport were doing wanted to do a policy on regulation and actually giving some sort of guide to charging infrastructure. That would be really good, because once we have these charging points being rolled out by the government, we can address range anxiety. Then the users, or rather us as the consumers, we can be able now to purchase EVs. Then now at that point, we'll now be talking about now the huge cost. After we have the charging points now, we can actually lobby the government to have policies on supporting fiscal incentives for EVs. Now then that can address the issue on the high costs, then hopefully eventually propel our country to tick all the stars in the policy environment. Then later, probably we talk about energy cost. So that is the brief on Kenya on standards and policy.
Thank you for that, Robert. It points to the sort of industry dynamics as far as developing standards, and it also indicates a huge gap in the sort of second-hand market and end-of-use applications of these mobility products that is yet to be, addressed, both at a global level and even here at a regional level in East Africa. The final comments would also be to Daniel from Uganda on the sort of private sector trends that we'll be seeing, probably given that you've been operating some of the and having the most experience in rolling out these electric two-wheelers and charging infrastructure. And there's still quite, even though the policy is lagging, but there's a lot of private sector activity. So what sort of policy trend, what sort of private sector trends do you see, not just in Uganda, but maybe across the East Africa region, given that you've interacted with quite a number of companies as well as roll out this technology?
I think here right now we are at a critical stage, and as we have several companies in the whole region. I mean, you know the numbers better than me, how many they are. It's now really about us finding our positioning along the whole ecosystem. For example, we at Sembo, we see ourselves in the long run as battery swap company, not as motorcycle company. So within our strategy, if we find a good partner to have a good electric motorcycle, which can use our battery swapping stations, we are more than happy. And here right now we see that the ecosystem is growing and is specifying the strategy. For example, a possible partner could be Rome out of Kenya, who sees themselves more as an OEM to manufacture motorcycles. But also here in Uganda, we have companies like Soleil, for example, who wants to go into the assembly and manufacturing of battery packs, which we can also use. So this is right now where we are standing. We have many companies, and now it will sort itself to see who is doing what. So it's a very interesting period for the whole sector. And in Uganda, something very important happened a couple of years ago already, where the Secretariat of Science, Technology and Innovation at the Office of the President, I hope I got it right, the full name, put us all on a table several times through think tanks, through meetings, through exhibitions, to streamline this effort, because there in Uganda and in the region, now it's up on us to maybe also step ahead of this lack of policy. The policy will come, but of course we are startups. Yes, I hope I'm back now.
Yes, you are.
Can you hear me? Okay, where did I cut?
On the sort of the recent unfolding that had happened.
Yes, so it's now up on us to work together as the different players, and honestly also regional. I can buy a battery, for example, in Uganda. I can buy it also in Kenya from Acceleron. The problem here right now on the East African market is that e-mobility doesn't have a scale. If I buy a locally assembled battery, it has 3-4 times the price compared to a battery I import from China. And this here is also the hen and the egg problem, because basically there is no scale. I'm very sorry about this. I hope it should be better now. So yeah, it's now about the strategic positioning of all startups, and then to work together to localize as many supply chains as possible into the region and into the specific countries, because the potential is huge. Just alone for Uganda, we speak about 10 to 12 to 15,000 motorcycles imported every month. So we need to work together now to make this happen and to have a successful transition to do electric mobility and electric motorcycles here.
Thanks for that. I think it also points towards the need for partnerships and collaborations across the region. Given that the e-mobility space is very resource constrained, we know majority of the imports are coming from the Asian countries. And so if individual companies are trying to work with OEMs, then with very low orders, then we cannot be prioritized. But if we can find ways of synergizing efforts to, go after some of these orders of batteries, orders of vehicles, so as not to also be a victim of the supply chain challenges that are happening across the globe. I understand even after deployment of funds into e-mobility startups, that rollout and ensuring an efficient supply chain has been something that has affected quite a number of e-mobility companies, and that has a big impact on the market perception and market uptake, because it can cause inconveniences to the end customers. So thank you all for those very insightful points. I'll now quickly move on to display the call to action letter that we had shared out as IAMDA. So with the support of the United Nations Environment Programme, we as IAMDA are pushing for certain actions that need to be made or implemented to support e-mobility in Africa. This is a call to action to African governments and even international and just get that correct document. Right. So this is the call to action for supporting e-mobility across the continent. We have 13 points that we have highlighted in this document. A link to it has been shared. Would like you to review, take your time and add your signature to the bottom. This call to action letter follows the COP27 discussions that have been happening globally, we are pushing for more attention towards supporting e-mobility because we understand the benefits that will come to it in realizing energy independence, as well as promoting locally generated power and creating new jobs. This is an industry that's very young, and we have an equal opportunity in transitioning the whole continent towards clean transport. So some of the, I just highlight in the bold sections on each of these points. Number one is to have a commitment from the global north. Number two is having support of the African government to develop EV policies that are very proactive and forward-looking. Number three is having fiscal policy, non-fiscal policies to support both the supply side and the demand side. We need time-bound incentives. Not only should we just be lowering duties, but also encouraging local assembly and manufacturing. We need to have a push on subsidies on these fuels. These are investments that could otherwise be channeled to either developing more e-mobility charging infrastructure, as well as supporting local industries for assemblies of these vehicles. Number 6 is having a cutoff date for this, for selling ICE vehicles. We've already started speaking about the dumping of ICE vehicles that's bound to happen if we don't have strengthened policies in Africa. Number 7 is to support local assembly and manufacturing. Number 8 is to accelerate the adoption of electricity infrastructure. This is very important for utilities that have poor or weak grids, to strengthen them and ensure that we can accommodate and safely charge these electric vehicles and batteries. Obviously, it comes with a call to invest in charging infrastructure. Number 10 is an increased opportunity in demand from charging these EVs. I think it's an interesting time and can create interesting business models around time of use tariff, around charging and battery swapping facilities. Adoption of products to African context is important because many of these OEMs or suppliers are out in the Asian countries, and we need products to be adopted for the African context. Supporting non-motorized transport and cyclists is also another push. And finally, ensuring a just transition that has inclusion elements, not just for gender, but also economic and social inclusion. So that's it. I would like for you to have a look at this call to action document. Please review. Add your signature. We shall be putting out all the signatories in one location, and you can share it out with your networks as well, because we'd like to make a big push from the African continent and the African organizations that are in support of this e-mobility transition. Questions and comments will also be responded to. If they haven't been responded to, we'll pick them up and carry on with our panelists, and we can send you responses to this. A recording of this conversation would also be compiled and shared out to all the attendees. Finally, if you haven't received the document, please just type in the section. We'll take down your email and send you these country profiles. Unfortunately, we are 6 minutes over time, and this is where we'll have to end the session. We thank you all for attending today's session. Tomorrow we'll be launching the West African country profiles for Ghana and Nigeria, so please tune in. The registration email has already been sent out to all of you. And a big thank you to our supporters for this particular document, that is the United Nations Environment Programme and Kawisafi. So thank you all and enjoy the afternoon.